Mhm.
You looking at a young black king.
Astro project, blast of a tech, pass your neck with the shit to leave a rapper and Rex from the back of a black Acura. Bullet ricocheted and it's weight and it passed through your pecs. The assassin wet. All y'all know y'all don't have to go. Sawed off shoddy, make you potty, probably call the law. Me no gangster, I'm no tough, got me child of the most high. I get on the mic and you go, bye bye. Devil don't test me, I throw shrapnel where your chest be. Shooting our family down in the streets. Fuck the police, they ain't marching for me. Pull up, not that Rari, I ain't bad yet. I pull up, out that 85% of mass at. I put this on God, bad black is so hard. Bitch, I'm going back to Harlem in my West African garb.
Alafia, Jama Boka, ETM Hotel, Rennie Sean, welcome in peace. My name is Sean. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning into the Mossy Warrior Clan YouTube channel. I know it's a little late in the evening for a lot of you guys and ladies out there. As you're coming into the building, please like the show, share the show, tell a friend we're live. We're about to get into a nice little conversational piece. And not really, it'll be a conversational piece, but it's going to be broken down into segments. And we're really going to get into a lecture that took place years ago. And it's about the miseducation of Black boys. And we're going to focus on a little bit of that to see if there's something that's going on with us mentally that has led to that and continues to lead to that today. While referring to this particular lecture and breaking this down into a little series, we will also revisit, and I don't know if many of you even have this written work. This ain't Kofi, it's Sean. But peace. But we're going to get into we're going to get into Carter G. Woodson's work as well. So give me 1 second. Nah, I'm gonna take that back. Let's go a step further. We're gonna go a step further with the work. Bear with me just a second. Yeah, we're gonna go a step further with the research. Where my book at? Nah, we're gonna stay with Carter. Oh, it's all good. So, how many of y'all actually own the book, The Miseducation of the Negro? Put a 1 in the chat if you own a book. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. Do you own that book? Yo, hit the like button, share the show, like the show, share the show, man. Let's have some fun. It's that late night education going on. It's late night, man. Rock with your boy. Get the people in the building, man. Share the show. Put it on your social media. All right, so I assume not everybody got the book. Okay, cool. So, in the opening chapter of this particular book, The Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson let me get to it. That the educated Negroes have the attitude of contempt toward their own people because in their own, as well as in their mixed schools, Negroes are taught to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. He says, of the hundreds of Negro high schools recently examined by an expert in the United States Bureau of Education, only 18 offer a course taking up the history of the Negro. And in most of the Negro colleges and universities where the Negro is thought of, the race is studied only as a problem or dismissed as a little consequence. For example, an officer of the Negro University thinking that an additional course of the Negro should be given there called upon a Negro doctor or of philosophy of the faculty to offer such work. He promptly informed the officer that he knew nothing about the Negro. He did not go to school to waste his time that way. He went to be educated in a system which dismisses the Negro as a non-entity. I'm going to say that again. The educated Negroes have the attitude of contempt toward their own people because in their own, as well as in their mixed schools, Negroes are taught to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. Of the hundreds of the Negro high schools recently examined by an expert in the United States Bureau of Education, only 18 offer a course taking up the history of the Negro, and in most of the Negro colleges and universities where the Negro is thought of, the race is studied only as a problem or dismissed as a little consequence. For example, an officer of the Negro University thinking that an additional course of the Negro should be given there called upon a Negro doctor of the philosophy of the faculty to offer such work. He promptly informed the officer that he knew nothing about the Negro. He did not go to school to waste his time that way. He went to be educated in a system which dismisses the Negro as an entity. At a Negro summer school 2 years ago, a white instructor gave a course of the Negro, using for his text a work which teaches that whites are superior to blacks. When asked by one of the students why he used such a textbook, the instructor replied that he wanted them to get that point of view. Even schools of Negroes then are places where they must be convinced of their inferiority. The thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. If he happens to leave school after he masters the fundamentals before he finishes high school or reaches college, he will naturally escape some of the biases and may recover in time to be of service to his people. Practically, all of the successful Negroes in the country are of the uneducated type or of that of Negroes who have had no formal education at all. The large majority of the Negroes who have put on the finishing touches of our best colleges are all but worthless in the development of their people. If after leaving school, they had the opportunity to give out to Negroes what traducers of the race would like to have it learned, such persons may thereby earn a living at teaching or preaching what they have been taught, but they never become a constructive force in the development of the race. The so-called school then becomes a questionable factor in the life of this despised people. What up, Fitz? As for another has well said, to handicap a student by teaching him that his blackface is a curse and that his struggles to change his conditions is hopeless is the worst such sort of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms him to van bondage and crime. It is strange then that the friends of the truth and the promoters of freedom have not risen up against the present propaganda in the schools and crushed it. This crusade is much more important than the anti-lynching movement because there would be no lynching if it did not start in the classroom or schoolroom. Why not exploit, enslave, and exterminate a class that everybody is taught to regard as inferior? To be more explicit, we may go to the seat of the trouble. Our most widely known scholars have been trained in universities outside the South. Northern and Western institutions, however, have had no time to deal with matters which concern the Negro, especially. They must direct their attention to the problems of the majority of their constituents. And too often they have stimulated their prejudices by referring to the Negro as unworthy or of consideration. Most of what these universities have offered as language, mathematics, and science may have served as good purpose, but much of what they have taught as economics, history, literature, religion, and philosophy is propaganda. And can't that involve a waste of time and misdirected the Negroes thus trained?
And the School of Education are co-sponsoring a 2 credit course on the miseducation of Black boys. As most of you in the room know, that there are certain demographic groups who, just by the nature of the group into which they are born, are at significant risk for academic failure. The more African-American males in prison than there are in college, and the litany goes on and on. And so in general, there's this incredibly negative public image of what it means to teach in lower income schools, to work with lower income families, and specifically that those issues get stereotyped in the life of Black boys. So it's rarer in the educational establishment to find somebody who has such a clear vision of what is strong and powerful in the life of Black boys and girls and other kids of color, and is willing to dedicate their life in this incredible combination of direct instruction and teaching, being in the classroom, running a school, influencing policy throughout the state of California, and also being willing to come out and share his perspective with the rest of the world. So I've had Dr. Holly come in and work with trainings with me in Wisconsin. And the one thing I would like to say, as many of you know, that as open as I am for discussion and dialogue, I'm hard to convince, particularly when I have a strong opinion. And he was able to lead me into understanding of the linguistic issues for African-American families in a way that I found not only powerful in its intellectual quality, but convincing in terms of structuring my own approaches to pedagogy. So without much further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Holly to you and turn the mic over, and hope you enjoy it. Be ready and be willing to ask a lot of stimulating questions at the end. Thanks.
Good evening. Good evening. Come on, I'm from LA. Good evening. I want to thank Dean Coleman for the invitation. It's good to know people in high places, as they say. And I appreciate him bringing me out to Boston University. It's really my first time in Boston. I was here when I was a kid, don't remember too much. So we're very open to the invitation, even though I was hoping for a little warmer weather, of course. But oh well. As he said, you know, we're sort of at the crossroads of doing this work. And I kind of have 3 different vantage points that I think benefit overall. And I'm just going to cover them a little bit, and then I'm just going to jump right into what we do. The first vantage point is from the university perspective. I'm a professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills. which is essentially a teacher training university. Cal State Dominguez Hills credentials the most teachers of color in California. And I work there and mainly in secondary education around reading, language, literacy issues. A lot of our students work in the LA sort of stereotypical urban schools, you know, Los Angeles Unified, Compton, Long Beach, many of our students going to that. I work the past couple of years with Teach for America cohort. So I have specifically Teach for America students, which is a whole nother story. Trying to convince them to stay longer than 2 years, which I think we're doing an okay job. That's one vantage point. So I have that sort of perspective of the university trying to deal with this. Then my second vantage point is as a co-director and founder of an independent charter school in Los Angeles called the Culture and Language Academy of Success. And that's a kindergarten through 8th grade school. We have 350 students, and we're known because we have all African-American students. We're 100% African-American. And the only all African-American school in the state, and certainly in the LA area. And we have great literacy results. 60% of our students score 80, 60% and above in AYP, the annual yearly progress, which is the federal monitor. So we have people coming from all over the country to see what we're doing around the linguistic affirmation that we do. And then my third hat is what I'm doing with you today. Well, let me go back. Certainly being at the school site keeps me grounded, keeps it real, if you know what I mean. So, because we're dealing with students, we're dealing with parents, we're dealing with all the issues that are at a school site. And our goal is to create a school-wide model using the approach I'm going to introduce to you today. So that's very important work for me because I don't get too distant from what the real issues are in terms of working with African-American children, particularly African-American males, where we have a reputation for having a lot of success. A lot of schools send us the students who they're having trouble with, per se, right? But when they come to our school, they don't have, I'll say, as much trouble. We had a student, his name is, I can say his name is Craig Jones, and he went to the UCLA sort of laboratory school. It's called Seeds Elementary. And he was in the office every single day. His parents are well-to-do. His mom's a lawyer. His dad is a professional. And he was in the office every day. And his mom brought him to us and she said, I know my kid's not bad. He's a good kid. But for whatever reason, he stays in the office. I think in the 3 years that Craig was with us, he was only in the office twice. Well, with me at least, right? And now he goes to Loyola High School in LA, which is a pretty high level parochial school there for us in the community there. So we've had some success using the approach I'm going to introduce with those students. The last hat is what I'm doing with you today, and that's traveling around the country teaching teachers about the approach and in the context, as Dean Coleman mentioned, of the failure. I'm not there for my good looks, you know what I'm saying? I'm there because, as you can see, I'm not a humble guy, right? I'm there because the school is in some type of program improvement status. They're under some type of mandate, some type of edict around their lack of success with namely African-American students, but we can broaden that. And they've been told if you don't demonstrate or if you don't show that you're doing something to specifically address this, then we're going to come with some type of sanction or something like that. So many of the districts and many of the teachers that I work with, they're under that pressure. And it's sort of been a good thing in a way that it sort of opened the door for this conversation. Because I've been doing this about 11 years now, prior to No Child Left Behind, you really didn't have a lot of these school districts open to this type of conversation. So it's had an unintended effect, I think. And so we work primarily in Northern California, but we have situations in St. Louis, in New York, in different places. And what I mean by that means that we're working with the students and the teachers in the classroom, which is our overall goal. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. So what you see here is sort of a mixture of all of that kind of put together. So just to kind of go along with the theme of the time, I changed my title to Your Culturally Responsive Stimulus Package. And I'm looking at it, we're in terms of how we can take some of the lessons that we're trying to learn from the economic situation and how can we apply it to the education situation. And the economic situation has been described as a crisis. And certainly those of us who've been in education, we can make a similar description as a crisis. But we see every crisis as an opportunity, as has been said. And so this is an opportunity for us to really bring a layer that we think can benefit any type of attempt to try to bring improvement and change. And that is culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. And I'm just going to define it for you real fast. Culturally and linguistically responsive teaching is the validation and affirmation of the home language and culture for the purposes of transitioning or bridging for academic success and success in mainstream culture. And so what you're going to do is you're going to go to where the students are so that you can bring them where they need to be. Or, as we call it, be situationally appropriate. And situationally appropriate is really learning what cultural and linguistic norm is appropriate for the situation that I can code switch to, but without losing who I am in that process. So I don't have to change what's internal to me, culturally and linguistically, in order to speak standard English or academic language, depending on my audience. I can still maintain that. And that's what we do. That's what we do at our school in terms of our entire teaching. And what we're simply saying is that the school system is really based on making that code switch, but at the expense of who you are. And secondly, not going to where the students are. The analogy that we use is simply trying to think about how you learn. If you think about how you learned how to swim. Now, how you learned how to swim, probably one of two ways. The first way is you were thrown into the pool and the teacher was on the side saying, "That's it, kick, come on, do it, do it, do it." As you were flailing and it wasn't happening. And we know that in education to be what type of approach? It's called the sink or what? Swim approach, right? Then there's a second type where the teacher is actually in the pool with you, guiding you, holding you, instructing you, and then somehow slowly kind of lets go, and then you're doing it on your own. That's the approach that we're shooting for, the one where we meet the students in the pool and bring them along the way. So it has two components to it. The first component is culturally understanding where we are. And then the second component is linguistically understanding where we are. And it's based in instructional strategies. And that's why 90% of whom I talk to are practicing classroom teachers, because we're trying to get them to do their instruction in a different way, by first starting with their mindset and then ending with the practice. So what we're saying is we're not going to use guest speakers. We're not going to use posters. We're not going to use some type of ethnic cultural month. We're not going to use ethnic food day. We're not going to use ethnic dress day. That's not how we're going to get at this issue of diversity. That's not how we're going to get at this issue of culture. We're going to get at it by understanding more so where the students are culturally and linguistically and how we can accommodate or be responsive to them through the instructional practice, how we teach. And it's through that experience for the students that'll bring about the change that we want to see with them academically, behaviorally, and so on. So I want to begin, just to change the energy in the room, is to
how have we, let me rephrase that. How we have arrived at the present state of affairs can be understood only by studying the forces effective in the development of Negro education, since it was systemically undertaken immediately after emancipation. To point out merely the defects as they appear today will be of little benefit to the present and future generations. These things must be viewed in their historic setting. The conditions of today have been determined by what has taken place in the past. And in careful study of this history, we may see more clearly the great theater of events in which the Negro has played a part. We may understand better what his role has been and how well he has functioned in it. The idea of educating the Negroes after the Civil War was largely a prompting and philanthropy. Their white neighbors failed to assume this responsibility. These blacks had been liberated as a result of sectional conflict out of their former owners had emerged as victims. From this class, then the freedmen could not expect much sympathy or cooperation in the effort to prepare themselves to figure as citizens of modern republic. From functionaries of the United States government itself and from those who participated in the conquest of secessionists early came the plan of teaching these freedmen the simple duties of life as worked out by Freedmen's Bureau and philanthropic agencies. When systemized, this effort became a program for the organization of churches, schools, and the direction of them along lines which had been considered most conducive to the progress of people otherwise circumstanced. Here and there, some variations was made in the program in the view of the fact that the status of the freedmen in no way paralleled that of their friends and teachers, but such thought was not general. When the Negroes in some way would learn to perform the duties which other elements of the population had prepared themselves to discharge, they would be duly qualified. It was believed to function as citizens of the country, in so much as most Negroes lived in the agricultural South. Moreover, and only a few of them at first acquired small farms, there was little in their life which anyone thought could not have easily understood. The poverty which inflicted them from a generation from emancipation held them down to the lowest order of society, nominally free but economically enslaved. The participation of the freedmen in the government for a few years during the period of the Reconstruction had little bearing on the situation, except that they did join with uneducated poor whites in bringing about certain much desired social reforms, especially in giving the South its first plan of democratic education and providing for a school system at public expense. Neither this inadequately supported school system nor the struggling to higher institutions of classical order established about the same time, however, connected the Negroes very closely with life as it was. These institutions were concerned rather with life as they hoped to make it. When the Negro found himself deprived of influence in politics, therefore, and at the same time unprepared to participate in the higher functions in the industrial development which this country began to undergo, it soon became evident to him that he was losing ground in the basic things of life. He was spending his time studying about the things which had been or might be, but he was learning little to help him do better the task at hand. Since the Negroes believed that the causes of this untoward condition lay without the race, migration was attempted and the immigration to Africa was again urged. At this psychological moment came the wave of industrial education, which swept the country by storm. The educational authorities in the cities, states, and throughout the Black Belt began to change the course of study to make the training of the Negro conform to this policy. The missionary teachers from the North, in defense of their idea of more liberal training, however, fearlessly attacked this new educational policy, and the Negroes participating in the same dispute arrayed themselves respectively on the side of the other. For a generation thereafter, quarrels as to whether a Negro should be given a classical or practical education was the dominant topic in the Negro schools and churches throughout the United States. Labor was the most important thing of life, it was argued. Practical education counted in reaching that end, and the Negro worker must be taught to solve this problem of efficiency before directing attention to other things.
By doing an activity with you, and then coming back to talk a little bit about race and culture, then going to another activity, and then coming back to talk about the language piece. So that's how we're going to sort of tag team this. Hopefully each of you has a strip. Yeah. The packet that you have is sort of pieces of my full day packet, which is a 6-hour presentation. And I just didn't know it's hard to determine your audience. So I kind of put in a little bit of everything, and some of it we'll get to, some of it we won't. And I'll explain, what each is as we go along. Then you have, which is really a promotional piece through Prentice Hall, as I'm one of the contributing artists for Prentice Hall. I don't know what this is. We'll fix this in a minute. And what we're going to be doing is, we work with Prentice Hall and how they can infuse some of these strategies into their text. Then I also have a DVD clip that I want to show towards the end, because a lot of people want to see, like, what does it actually look like in the classroom? So I'm going to show you a clip from our charter school that shows you what it looks like in the classroom. And one of the advantages that we have in something that's a highly theoretical area, culturally responsive teaching, is we have the practice part. So it's not just theory. In fact, in our full sessions, it's very little theory. It's only the first part of the day, and then the rest of the day we focus on strategies. So you have these strips, and we're going to do an activity that's called a tea party. A tea party. Now, this is a culturally and linguistically responsive strategy that comes out of second language learning. And what the big issue is, you understanding what makes it culturally responsive. And what makes it culturally responsive is that, first of all, is movement. There's movement involved. And movement in this case means you're going to be getting out of your seats, right? You're going to be standing up, okay? The second piece that makes it culturally responsive is that it's sociocentric. And what that means is that it involves talking as part of the instruction. Because many times the students who are being unsuccessful, they are being who they are, but in the context of school, it's seen as negative, it's seen as disruptive, defiant, deviant, whatever is on the referral slip, basically, right? And a lot of these kids end up in the office for reasons that are, we feel, culturally based. And in the classroom, there's just a cultural misunderstanding. So what we try to get teachers to do is build in who they are into the instruction. So you have to build in talking. That doesn't mean that the students get to talk when they want, however they want, but we're going to allow them that sort of momentary exchange prior to jumping into the content, okay? The other aspect of this is the greeting. How you greet somebody is cultural as well. We're going to build that in as well. So these are all what we call cultural orientations. So the rules for this tea party is, number one, you have to stand up and walk around. That's number one, okay? Number two, prior to introducing your content, you have to culturally greet the person, right? And that means physically and verbally. And it has to be through a cultural orientation, which may be, I don't have anybody in the front row, so I can't do this, is some type of like a soul shake, if that's your cultural orientation. And I would be demonstrating this. Or a cheek kiss, both sides, if that's a cultural orientation. High five, elbow, pound, bear hug, whatever, right? And, we understand that now the hug has become the new handshake. You guys know that, right? People are hugging more now than handshaking. So whatever cultural orientation works for you, all right? And then as part of the verbal part, I just want you to tell the person, I'm my best today because, okay? Because we have to give the students some frame. Otherwise, they will talk about whatever they, the kind of goofy stuff that middle school or secondary students talk about, right? So you have to give them, give them a frame. So I want you to say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm my best today because, and then you sort of fill in that blank. Then you're going to jump into your content. And in this case, the content is to read the strips to one another verbatim, all right? Don't cheat. I want you to read it just like it is on the table, on the slip. And then you kind of go like, wow, that's interesting, or I'm not sure what you just said, but whatever you want to do there, okay? And then you go to a different person. I want you to do this with 3 different people in the room. 3 different people in the room. And then after that third person, you return to your seats. Now, the last rule is you can't talk to anybody in your row. So these 4 ladies right here, they can't talk to one another. Okay, these 2 gentlemen here, they can't talk to one another. So you can't talk to anyone in your immediate row. And that's to encourage us kind of walking around mixing up with one another. All right? So, yes.
History is projected in this culture as being irrelevant. I don't think by accident. Again, if it is made to look irrelevant, if it is made to look unprofitable, then making it appear so much serves some profitable purpose. When courses in college or universities are apparently presented non-politically, objectively, neutrally, they are actually presented in the most political way. We must understand that it is in the nature of this racist culture to hide its political agenda. Therefore, it presents so called facts as information as if they have no political connections or implications. I often try to show how making something political creates knowledge and information that can be of great value. I often use the concept of Skinner rat to show how that concept is present non-politically in the psychology of learning, how the rat is put in a box and can only eat if its perfumes a particular behavior. I mean, performs a particular behavior. So if it pushes a lever, it is only as a result of pushing that lever that it is allowed to eat. The experimenter determines when the rat is going to eat, when it's going to drink. He determines the living conditions under which this rat must survive. The rat becomes conditioned and changes as a result of the fact that the man has control of the vital things in its life. Thus, we can present this paradigm in a very sterile way in terms of learning and reinforcement principles. We can write a whole book about them with graphs, arcane language, and the whole bit. I often point out how a black student can learn Skinnerian psychology better than a white student, and still, as a result of having learned it, be made dumb by it because it is taught on a racial, neutral, non-political level. But I often ask my students whether there is only one way of looking at this situation. Why not look at it politically? This rat is conditioned, i.e., it reflects the conditions under which it's forced to survive as a result of the set of power relations. So, why not analyze this experiment in terms of power relations? Based on these terms, we may reach the conclusion that the conditioned rat is socially created, its personality is social creation. What it learns is the result of power differential between the rat and the experimenter because the experimenter has power over the rat and uses that power to transform and create something new in that rat. As a result of the conditioning experiment, the rat is different from other unconditioned rats. It shows the effects of its conditioning. The experimenter is able to do this because the experimenter has control over the rat's circumstances. If we will go further and identify with that rat, we then begin to learn something about ourselves, something of value. We will then have grasp of something that can lay the foundation for revolution and change, not a sterile bit of knowledge and information that we can't use. Let's skip ahead. If you're just joining us, man, we reviewing a lecture of as you can see here. I'm gonna give it to y'all so y'all can see the miseducation of black boys. And basically, we are also referring to Carter G. Woodson's work, The Miseducation of the Negro, as well as Dr. Amos Wilson, The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy. And what I just read from is pretty much out of Dr. Amos Wilson's book, right? So some people will try to paint this series as Blackology, but in understanding how we got here historically will help draw the connections. So what we're going to do is in this, I'm gonna make this a series. It's only gonna be like a 3-part series, maybe 4, because I don't know how much time I'm gonna invest in each part of it. But we're going to walk through these things in a way to understand what this brother was trying to do in his lecture in 2009 about the miseducation of black boys and the reference to. And we're going to use tools from the past because Carter G. Woodson had painted a picture previously a long time ago. Amos Wilson had followed up that concept dealing with the psychiatry of African Americans, especially when it comes from a historical narrative. And then we're still having unanswered questions regarding the education of black boys today. And this lecture, being 12 years old, has much relevance today.
The language, number one. and then also some of the characterizations, just so they can get a general sense of the story. So it's an into read. It's an into activity. When I was in the classroom, I used to put lines from Shakespeare on those strips prior to reading Romeo and Juliet. Or you could put math problems on the strips, or you can put science, whatever. And then have the students in exchange like this, and then come back and read and be ready to participate in the reading. So also in terms of second language issues or learning, it's meant to generate language in the room. And that's so important for the sociocentric aspect, because a lot of issues for students learning standard English is needing to sort of be able to speak it and hear it, because usually at school, for many of these students, it's one of the few places they're going to get access in this type of way. So we want to have those opportunities for them to engage one another in different types of ways. And so that simple activity like that enables me to accomplish all of that. And at the same time, I'm building in that culture and language piece. And so that's just a sample of what we do in terms of a whole sort of body of work with teachers to get them to focus on what they need to focus on. The first thing that we have to do, though, is talk about what is culture and why do we have this focus. And so I want to just give you a little bit of that so you'll understand the basis of this. What we have to do is really quickly or just really to the point. We don't have to spend a lot of time. We don't really need a lot of statistics. Okay. I have a standard sort of bet across the country with anybody who could find me positive statistics that are not related to the achievement gap. We don't even call it achievement gap anymore, because it doesn't accurately define the weight or the crisis of the problem. See, a gap seems small. This is a, I don't even know what you want to call it. This is an ocean. It's huge when you really look at it. So we already know. I used to show a whole bunch of data slides, but it's no point. I mean, everyone knows the sort of depth of the issue. So we have to just cut to the chase and say, well, who are we talking about? And we sort of broaden it to say underserved students first, so that we understand that the schools, in terms of talking about their failure, have not been successful with many populations. So we talk about underserved being any student who's in the school system that is not being responded to in a way that he or she can be successful. That's how we define underserved. And for a moment, it takes it off race, culture, and language, so that I could be in a district in Kansas that's 90% white, yet still talking about this topic, right? Because we're addressing it under this broader notion of who's underserved in the school district. But then we ask the question, if we were to bring the underserved students to the auditorium, what would they look like, right? Using that broad definition, any student who's not being responded to in a way that he or she can be successful. Think about who those students are. Now let's bring them to the auditorium. Who do they look like? And match with the research, they look like these students here. Now enters race, culture, and language, because those are the students that are being identified as underserved. And the point that we have to make is that that's not where we started, though. We started with a broader definition. But the research says that these are the ones who are most likely to be underserved. And in terms of a cultural way of looking at it, there's particular 4 groups, and the broader area is voluntary immigrants versus involuntary immigrants. And we're pulling from the work of John Agbu, late 70s sort of work, where he basically said that, there are 2 types of students in the American education system: voluntary immigrants, involuntary immigrants. And he said that they have different paths. One is a path to success. The other one is not successful. And under the involuntary immigrants, we looked at these 4 populations in particular, because we noticed that they had a socio-political and socio-linguistic commonality. The socio-political commonality was they were colonized, conquered, or enslaved as their introduction into America, meaning that the process of assimilation came through this process here, being colonized, conquered, or enslaved. And they were Hawaiian Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. And in the full day, we would talk about a little bit about that history. And what we realize is that they were essentially locked out of the system that makes them quote unquote Americans, if you will, and therefore never really had that access or opportunity. And it's different for each one. So in the context of Africans in America, we're looking at a 300-year history of being locked out. Then we have a socio-linguistic commonality, meaning that in these first two generations, they spoke the transition from their indigenous languages to what the linguists call non-standard languages, what we call hybrid languages. And so today, it's known as Hawaiian Pidgin English, Native American dialects, Chicano English for Mexican Americans, and Black English or African American Vernacular English. And that these are intact linguistic entities that are based on that history of being locked out of formal second language instruction if you came about through one of these ways. So again, using the Africans as an example, when the Africans came to any of the Americas, these were the rules. If you speak your African tongue, it'll be cut out. If you congregate with 2 or 3 or more, you'll be beaten. It's against the law for you to learn the language of the land. You can't go to school, no Rosetta Stone, right? Okay. And so the linguists began to ask, well, then how could they acquire the language? And so some linguists have a theory that is based on a relexified language, which means you have the vocabulary of the dominating culture, but you still have the grammatical base of the indigenous language in place. Okay. And so culturally and linguistically, that's what we have going on with these four populations in particular, as we define them as being underserved. Another way that we look at it is we call them standard English learners. And a standard English learners is defined that they speak a home language that differs, and this is important, in all the dimensions of language. So it differs in terms of the phonology, the morphosyntax, the syntax, which is the grammar, the semantics, vocabulary, and even the rhetorical aspect, which is the discourse, how you tell the story. And these students then come into a situation, school, where if you go through each category, they do it differently. And so what we have to do then is recognize them as standard English learners and then begin to use instruction that would be responsive to them being in the situation. And that's we feel like it's going to get them to the success we want them to have for standard English and academic language. The problem is, though, that many folks do not see the legitimacy in terms of these four groups, culture and language. And so that's where the validation and affirmation comes in. So validate for us is to make legitimate what mainstream has made illegitimate and the institution has made illegitimate, culturally and linguistically. And affirm is to make positive what the institution and mainstream media has made negative for culture and language for these groups. So when we think of Hawaiian Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, we don't think of legitimacy in terms of culture and language. So when you say, well, what is African American language, or what is Chicano English? People would give it a deficit sort of definition: ghetto, gibberish, broken English, so on and so forth. No legitimacy. If you say, well, what is Black culture? What do you mean by Black culture? Are you talking about hip hop? No legitimacy. Are you talking about, food?
Think about what he's saying right here, and I'm gonna rewind it back so you can hear it very clearly. When you've heard me say this, you know what I'm saying? What is Black culture, or what is it to be an American? Right? Never properly defined in its aspects of the argument. What is it? Think about it. The first thing that people think about when you do what is this, they say these things.
What is Chicano English? People would give it a deficit sort of definition: ghetto, gibberish, broken English, so on and so forth. No legitimacy. If you say, well, what is Black culture? What do you mean by Black culture? Are you talking about hip hop? No legitimacy. Are you talking about, food, dress, dance, music? No legitimacy. So what we have to do is take a little time to talk about, if we're going to be culturally responsive, then we have to legitimize what has been made illegitimate by the institution in very explicit terms. So we do this through an activity that we're just going to do a little bit of. That we delve into what is culture, what is Ebonics, and then how does it play into the failure of the system. And we do this it's a diversity activity that's called Why Are We Confused? But I've changed it to Is Obama Our First Black President? All right.
The greatest indictment of such education as Negroes have received, however, is that they have thereby learned little as to making a living, the first essential in civilization. Rural Negroes have also known something about agriculture, and in the country where land is abundant, they have been able to make some sort of living on soil, even though they have not always employed scientific methods of farming. In industry, where the competition is keener, however, what the Negro has learned in school has had little bearing on the situation, as pointed out above. In the business, the role of education as a factor in the uplift of the Negro has been still less significant. The Negroes of today are unable to employ one another, and the whites are inclined to call on Negroes only when workers of their own race have been taken care of. For the solution of this problem, the miseducated Negro has offered no remedy whatsoever. What Negroes are now being taught does not bring their minds into harmony with life as they must face it. When a Negro student works his way through college by polishing shoes, he does not think of making a special study of the science underlying the production and the distribution of leather and its products that he may someday figure in this sphere. The Negro boy sent to college by a mechanic seldom dreams of learning mechanical engineering to build upon the foundation his fathers had laid, that in the years to come he may figure as a contractor or a consultant engineer. The Negro girl who goes to college hardly wants to return to her mother if she is a washwoman. But this girl should come back with the sufficient knowledge of physics and chemistry and business administration to use her mother's work as a nucleus for a modern steam laundry. A white professor of a university recently resigned his position to become rich by running a laundry for Negroes in the southern city. A Negro college instructor would have considered such a suggestion an insult. The so-called education of the Negro college graduates leads them to the throwaway opportunities which they have and to go in quest of those which they do not find. In the case of the white youth in this country, they can choose their courses more random and still succeed because of numerous opportunities offered by their people. But even they show so much more wisdom than do Negroes. For example, a year or two after the author left Harvard, he found out the west of a schoolmate who was studying wool. How did you happen to go into this sort of thing? The author inquired. His people, the former replied, had some experience in wool, and in college he prepared for this work. On the contrary, the author studied Aristotle, Plato, and Marsilio of Padua and Rathburdus when he was in college. His friends who studied wool, however, is now independently rich and has sufficient leisure to enjoy the cultural side of life, which is his knowledge of the science of underlining his business development. But the author has to make his living by begging for a struggling cause. Let's get to Obama.
And what I mean by that is this right here. I'm going to give you a statement. If you understand this statement, then you are not confused. If you don't understand the statement, then I'm sorry to tell you, you're confused. Okay? You can be African American, and not black. You can be African American and not black. Right? Now, if you understand what I'm saying, you're not confused. But if some of you looking like, what the heck is he talking about right now? Then you are confused. And I want to talk about that confusion a little bit, because this is what confounds the issue in terms of culture responsive teaching in particular, but I also think in terms of how we're dealing with the achievement gap, because we have misidentified our labels, if you will, right? And the Barack Obama reference is initially he had issues around legitimizing himself to the Black community as being a candidate of Black culture, if you will, versus just being an African American. Okay. And it took him a while to sort of gain that type of support. I mean, there are different variables, but it took him a while to gain that type of support. And I think part of it is because when you look at someone racially, it's different when you're looking at them ethnically. But when it comes to the four groups I just described, there's not that ethnic identification. All right. So we can't go through all these identities today, but I want to give you the how we're all layered in these ways, and we recognize those. We're all sort of created by all these different identities, and we have to peel the onion to understand them each in their place in a sort of analytical way. Then it makes, when we put them back together, it makes it stronger, which I call a true definition of diversity, is looking at us in all these different ways. What I want to do is race. I want to start off with the race one, and then see if we can jump down to culture, since that's the main focus. So what I want you to do, you're going to do it just in the area where you are right now. I want you to give me your DNA lineage. What is your DNA lineage? What is your race? All right. I'm talking about your blood lineage. How would you identify yourself racially? Okay. And it's really just a one-word answer. And then I want you to try to give two identifiers that make you that race, if you will. Two things that you can say, I think this is what I'm associated with racially. Okay. Now, being from Boston is not a race. Okay. I just want to save a little time. All right. So we don't have that issue. Okay. Being Irish is not a race. Okay. So I want to save some time on that end as well. We're really looking at DNA. Like if they found your bones 80 years from now somewhere, what would they come up with? And you're going to do this by whipping around. We call it whip around. That means you.
So everybody that's tuned into this discussion right now, he's asking a legitimate question. What is your DNA lineage? What is your DNA lineage? Have you had a DNA test? Do you believe in DNA? What is your DNA lineage? I'm going to put mine in the chat. I put mine in the chat. If you're able to text, type, or anything like that, you're listening and you might be at work, my UK brothers, they're working right now. So I'm pretty sure that they may not be able to type anything in the chat, and they just might be listening in with their earbuds or might be in transit on their way to work. If you can type. And put what you think. What is your lineage? What is your DNA lineage?
You share in groups of 3 or 4, and you just go around and you say, this is my race, this is what identifies me, and then you bring it back. It should take no longer than 2 minutes per group, because you're talking for 30 seconds or less. So I'm going to call us back in about 2 minutes. Okay. So with your group right now, identify your race.
All right. So they cut the stream and they go there. So I want to try to touch on something before we come back to what he says and get into Amos Wilson a little bit. So we should look at history more accurately as psychohistory, i.e., the psychological result of undergoing certain historical experiences. We as individuals are our history. I'll show you later on that history is not that which is forgotten and left behind. We don't leave history behind. History is the present. History is the future. Those of us who are Afrocentric and mystical must know that the division of past, present, and future is false, Eurocentric, and political. The world is not a linear structure. Past, present, and future are one and the same. When we have been made to believe that the past is separate and in some straight line with the future, then we've already been brainwashed and set up. Our past never forgets us and is never left behind. If you forget your past, you would not be able to understand me right now. You will not be able to walk or talk. You did not learn to walk, talk, or do things you're doing at the moment you entered here. You learned to do them in the past. Forget that then. Since that is history, leave that behind. You will see that you also have no future. Past, present, and future are one. And that proposition is at the center of an African centered history and approach. As men with their knowledge and desire ultimately make history, so does history make them.
What we do is first we try to debunk some myths, basically, if you will, or different ways of looking at it. Number one is typically, we do this with all sizes, all different groups. Somebody in a group will say, I'm of the human race, right? We got any humans out there? All right. Show some love for the humans. And we try to point out that, being human only separates us from the other animals in the kingdom, basically. It just lets us know that, you're not a billy goat. Your presence here right now, unless you want to demonstrate something for us at 6 o'clock or whenever we're in this, right? And that there are races within the human race. So we're just talking about the animal kingdom. The second thing that we have to sort of debunk or address is this notion of mixed racial heritage, right? Because we're in this age where everybody's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this. And, it's kind of like, what am I? Well, if we understand our social history tells us very clearly, if you had any drop of non-European blood, then that's what race you were. And if that blood was African, it trumped everything. That's what our social history says. It's only till recently, very recently, that we began to acknowledge this notion of biracial or multiracial in terms of designation, okay? Because today you can actually buy your DNA breakdown at a cheap rate, relatively cheap rate. But I think a lot of people won't do it because they don't want to find out the truth. They don't want to find out where that kitchen came from. Now, only people who know what a kitchen is going to get that joke. If you don't know what a kitchen is, you're not going to get that joke, right? So people will be able to get to sleep tonight and not wonder what a kitchen is. The kitchen is the backside of your hair that naps up, and it's called the kitchen. And typically people of African descent have kitchens, right? So if you want to know if you have some African blood in you, one way to check is see if you got a kitchen, right? And it's a joke, but that's speaking to how the DNA ties in. Now I know some of you, when you leave, you're gonna walk down the hallway, you're gonna go, right? Okay. The third thing, and I want to acknowledge the scientists, the people who go with the racial is socially constructed argument. I mean, and that is that we're 99.9% alike genetically, okay, which is a scientific fact. But we think it's irrelevant to what's been happening in terms of the racial strife, turmoil that's happened in our history. It's really just a scientific fact. It has had no relevance in terms of what we've had to deal with based on that minute difference. So we go back and we just study, how does this racial classification come from? And it comes from partly due to the work of J.F. Blumenbach, who did the first scientifically received racial classification. And Blumenbach went all over the world, and he was looking for the most beautiful race of men. And he said that the people who lived in Russia near Mount Caucasus were the most beautiful race of men on earth. And he named them Caucasians. And that's where the term Caucasian comes from, based on the arbitrary decision of J.F. Blumenbach. Okay? So we have to understand that. And so then Blumenbach, kind of getting to the gentleman's question, then classify races based on geography. And he had an initial 5 groups: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, what he called natives or Americans, and then Malaysians. So if we were to follow the Blumenbach's classification, all of us would fall under one of these 5, okay? Blumenbach really, though, had a major contribution in terms of what we would identify as racially acceptable in terms of image. that still stands with us today, let alone the term Caucasian. Still stands with us today based on Blumenbach. But it's what he put forth, what was representative of beauty, that has stood and permeated in how we navigate, especially in the context of the school, but also in the macrocosm. Now, a lot of people, they don't believe what I'm saying for whatever reason. So we go to the original source of J.F. Blumenbach. This is what he said. On the Caucasian variety, I've taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood and especially the southern slope produces the most beautiful race of men. I mean the Georgian. And because all the physiological reasons converge to this. Besides, it is white in color, which we may fairly assume to be the primitive color of mankind, since it is very easy to degenerate into brown, but very much more difficult for dark to become white. And so he set forth with those words a mindset that would be representative of beauty that everything would be compared to based on an image. And remember, image is connected to mindset. I mean, we have the research about commercials and symbols and all that. Image contributes to mindset. And the mindset is that this image here would be representative of beauty. Now, you just think about it in a macrocosm. Think about our heroes. Think about our heroes and how they match the image. Think about our images of Jesus Christ and how they match the image. Think about Barbie dolls. You know, the 50th anniversary of Barbie doll was celebrated. And the image has remained the same over that time. And those dolls, when they want to quote unquote change the race, they're not racially changed. They're just dipped in a different color. But racially, it remains the same based on here, right here. By the way, Dora is now outselling Barbie. This is a side note. You want to know that, right? Worldwide, Dora the Explorer outsells Barbie now, right? Okay, so maybe there's a change coming there a little bit, right? Okay, so think of the school system and the images. Think of the textbooks, the literature books, the things that students have to look through. You know, Carl Grant, who studies textbooks, says that African-American students have a 7% chance of seeing an image that's truly reflective of who they are in the American textbook. Just a 7% chance. And then it gets less as you go through the different groups. So all this ties into culturally responsive teaching, in that in order to be culturally responsive, we have to work around where we're starting from in terms of that validation and affirmation. So when you come to our school, the students are inundated with images that are representative of who they are, The images are when they look in the books, they see themselves. Now, I'm not saying solely, but I'm saying as a starting place, because remember, we're going to transition them to what's going to be representative in the mainstream and in academia. So we're not trying to stay there. We're just trying to start there, rather than starting at what the society says, what you're not. So in order for a student to feel empowered, affirmed, validated, feel confident, you have to start where they are. And we know that a lot of the issues around African Americans, particularly African American males, is that they're not being approached or addressed based on who they are. They're being approached, they're being addressed based on what we want them to be. And we have to start where they are to move them in that direction. I want to give it to you from a student's perspective. So let me show you this clip from, this actually was sent to me by one of the teachers that we train in Oakland. He's the video teacher at a high school. This was a video that was done by high school students. And it was done around the issues of race. And it lets you know that when we allow the students to really grapple with this, they have the wherewithal to kind of come up and approach it from where we're coming from. It was a spoken word contest that the particular gentleman won, and then they took the spoken word contest and then showed it and turned it into this video.
My glance burned through her. And I'm sure that such actions aren't foreign to her because the essence of her beauty is, well, the essence of beauty. And in the presence of this higher being, the weakness of my masculinity kicks in, causing me to personify my wannabe big baller shark collar. God's gift to the female species, the shiny shoe, rapping like I get the second Jody, like a little much as I take your style, yo. this girl with no force, she gives me a dirty look with the quickness, like, boy, you must be stupid. So I'm looking at myself like, boy, you must be stupid. But looking upon her, I am kind of feeling her style. So I try again, but instead of addressing her properly, I blurt out one of my fake-ass playlistic lines like, girl, you must be a traffic ticket, because you got fine written all over you. Now she's trying to leave, and I'm trying to keep her here. And so when I finally tell her about her, girl, what is your ethnic makeup? See, at this point, her glare is scorching through me. And somehow she manages to make her brown eyes resemble some kind of brown fire or something. But there's no snap her head movement, no palm to face, click of tongue, middle finger, roll of eyes, or girl power chant. She just glares at me with these burning eyes in her gaze, grabs you by the throat, and she says, ethnic makeup. First of all, makeup just an anglicized, colonized, commodified utility that my sisters have been programmed to consume, forcing them to come from a natural state in order to emulate when another sister looks like in her natural state, because you can tell them that the other sister's natural state is more beautiful than the first sister's natural state. At the same time, the other sister isn't even in her natural state because she's trying to imitate yet another sister. So in actuality, the natural state that the first sister was trying to imitate wasn't even natural in the first place. Now, I'm thinking, damn, this girl's kicking knowledge. But meanwhile, she keeps spitting on it like, fine. I'll tell you about my ethnic makeup. I wear foundation, not that powdery stuff. I wear the foundation laid by my indigenous people. It's that foundation that makes it so the past being globalized, I can still vocalize with confidence. I know where my roots are. I wear this foundation not upon my face, but within my soul. And I take this from my ancestors, because I'll be damned if I ever let a European or American corporation tell me what my foundation should look like. And now I wear lipstick, but my lips stick to the ears of men so they can experience and surround sound my screams of agony with each flash of rulers, measuring tape, and scales, as if my waistline and weight are inversely proportional to my value as a human being. See, my lips, they stick, but not together. Rather, they flail open with flames to burn down this culture that once kept them shut. Now I mess with eyeshadow, but my eyes shadow over this time now when you're gonna end to keep me blind, but you can't cover my eyes, look into them. My eyes foreshadow change. My eyes foreshadow light. And I'm not into hair dyeing, but I'm here dying because this oppression just won't get out of my hair. They form these highlights of my past atrocities. They tangle around my mind. This oppression that manifests stressing me so that even though I don't color my hair in a couple of years, it'll look like I dyed it gray. So what's my ethnic makeup? I don't have any because your ethnicity isn't something you can just make up. And as far as that shit that my sisters put on their faces, that's not makeup. It's make-believe. I can't seem to look up at her. And I'm sure that such actions aren't foreign to her because her expression shows that she knows that my mind is in a trance. As her footsteps fade, my ego is left in crutches. And rejection never sounded so sweet.
All right. So that's from a student perspective there. And you see, they have a good grasp of where we're going with this, which is really saying that our racial identity only serves one purpose, and that is to identify our DNA lineage. It has nothing to do with who we are in terms of these other identities. I mean, I'm African, right? That is my racial DNA. Pigmentation of skin, texture of hair, prone to certain diseases. That's what it says. You know, I love the, I don't love it, but the Sally Field commercial, I love it for this work. The Sally Field commercial, you guys ever see the Sally? I forgot what it's for. I think it's for osteoporosis. But at the bottom, you see what it says? Does anybody know? See that with those commercials, gotta read the little, what does it say? Does anybody know? Say it again. The disclaimer, what does it say? Does anybody know what it says? Something about whites and Asians in terms of being prone to this. That's speaking to racial identity there. So what we're saying is, now that we know this, you cannot identify me by my race other than to say that I am of African descent. That's all it tells you. It does not tell you how smart I am. It does not tell you what music I like. It does not tell you what language I use. It does not tell you anything about my background. And anything that you come with that, you're making an assumption. You're making a prejudice. You're making a bias. So if we have that understanding, then we can take race and put it off the table. And know that this approach is not racially responsive education. It's culturally responsive education. And part of the confusion is we have too much focus on race, not enough focus on culture. I don't think it's about racism. I think it's about culturalism. And the students who are not being successful in our schools, it has less to do with the fact that they are of African descent and more to do with the fact that they are being Black. And that's why we have to understand that there's a difference between the two. I can meet somebody who's African American, but immediately know if they are black or not, and not make a judgment about them. And so our students who are being themselves in terms of their blackness, if we were really to disaggregate the data like that, then we would see this culturalism. We would see this culturalism versus this racism. Now,
when we get ready to create revolution, we must redefine the world and redefine words. There's no way around it. In Genesis, we see Adam being given the power to name things. Through being given the power to name things, he is given the dominion. There is a connection between the naming and the dominion, between naming and bringing into reality. When we permit another people to name and define, we permit another people to gain and dominion and control over us. The languages that people learn and speak are most frequently directly related to the power relations between them. Many people will now learn Japanese, as for a while they learn Russian, as for a while they learn German, Latin, etc. And why? Because the people who speak or spoke those languages were or are in ascendance or in power that or this time. There's no good English or bad English, or good language or bad language. There is language that connects to power. People tend to learn first after their native tongue, whatever language is spoken by the people in power. There's a connection between the capacity to have other people speak your language and to call things by the names you've given them and power. If we wish to assume power, then we must assume the capacity to name and define things. The psychology of a culture is to a great extent a symbolic precipitant of the kinds of experiences forced upon a group of people by their history. We must recognize the intimate relationship between culture, history, and personality. If we do not know our own history, then we do not know our personality. If the only history we know is other people's history, then our personality has been created by that history. We must recognize this in the case of European history. It is not so much that we know European history, because 90% of us don't know European history and have not read it, but that we are left with some image of it, some residue of it, that we have a sense of it, is all that the hegemonic European needs to begin to dominate and to control non-European people.
now we talk about nationality. What's the punchline on that? That is that we were all something before we became Americans, basically. Unless you are of WASP culture. WASP is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is the culture that all the other cultures in essence assimilated into. This comes from a body of work known as how the Irish became white, how the Jewish became white, how the Germans became white. If you read those texts, it talks about that cultural assimilation from being Irish, German, Jewish into being WASP. And that WASP becomes synonymous with American. So to be American, some would say, is really to be WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We can add in the religious factor.
Let me run that back. Let me run that back to brothers who push this whole narrative about we Americans, or X, Y, and Z sold us into slavery, or the misconceptions or misinterpretations of historical context and so on and so forth. So they say that we're American. So what is it to be American, my brother? What did you say?
And so our students who are being themselves in terms of their blackness, if we were really to disaggregate the data like that, then we would see this culturalism. We would see this culturalism versus this racism. Now we talk about nationality. What's the punchline on that? That is that we were all something before we became Americans, basically. Unless you are of WASP culture. WASP is white.
So to be American is to be a WASP. And what is WASP?
Disaggregate the data like that, then we would see this culturalism. We would see this culturalism versus this racism. Now we talk about nationality. What's the punchline on that? That is that we were all something before we became Americans, basically. Unless you are of WASP culture. WASP is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is the culture that all the other cultures, in essence, assimilated into. This comes from a body of work known as how the Irish became white, how the Jewish became white, how the Germans became white. If you read those texts, it talks about that cultural assimilation from being Irish, German, Jewish into being WASP. And that WASP becomes synonymous with American. So to be American, some would say, is really to be WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
So I want to insert this into the argument, WASP, because when I listen to people make arguments, right, and they use this whole notion that, you know what I mean, we're more American than X, Y, and Z. What is it to be American? Here is the clearest form of what it is to be an American. In the United States, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASP, are the white American Protestant elite, typically of British descent. WASP elite have dominated American society, culture, and politics for most of the history of the United States. After 1945, many Americans criticized the WASP hegemony and disparaged them as part of the establishment. Although the social influence of wealthy WASP has declined since the 40s, the group continues to play a central role in American finance, politics, and philanthropy. Anglo-Saxon refers to the people of British ancestry, but WASP is sometimes used more broadly by socialists and others to include all Protestant Americans of Northern European or Western European ancestry. WASP is also used for elites in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The 1998 Random House Unabridged Dictionary says the term is sometimes disparaging and offensive. Culture. Expensive private prep schools and universities have historically been associated with WASP. Colleges such as Ivy Leagues, Little Ivies, and Seven Sister Colleges are particularly intertwined with the culture. Until roughly World War II, Ivy League universities were composed largely of white Protestants. While admission to these schools is generally based upon merit, many of these universities give a legacy preference for the children of the alumni in order to link the elite and their wealth with the school. The legacy admissions allowed the continuation of WASP influence on important sectors of the U.S. Members of the Protestant Denomination Association with WASP have some of the highest proportions of advanced degrees. Examples include Episcopal Church, such as 76% of those, Pollard having some College of Presbyterian Church with 64. According to Scientific Elite Nobel Laureates in United States by Zuckerman between 1901 and 72, 72% of American Nobel Peace Prize winners have come from Protestant backgrounds, while Protestants made up roughly 67% of the U.S. population during the period of Nobel Prizes awarded to Americans between 1901 and 1972. 84% of those in chemistry, 60% in medicine, and 58% in physics were awarded Protestants.
We can add in the religious factor as well, okay? But what I really want to get to is culture. And what I want you to do now is I want you to identify what ethnic identity do you subscribe to? What ethnic identity resonates with your soul culturally? What moves you? What makes you think of home, community, and heritage from an ethnic standpoint? And once again, see if you can name two things that you can link to that identification. Two things that make you X in terms of interests, likes, in terms of heritage, in terms of experience. Now, remember, we've already released you. We've freed you. We've liberated you. If you are African American, you could say, I subscribe to WASP culture. It's okay. If you are Caucasian American, you could say, I subscribe to Korean culture, because that's the beauty of culture. You're not locked in. See, I'm locked in racially. Now, we got some of us, we try to change our race, right? We know we got some of those in the celebrity world, right? Okay. but there's been unsuccessful attempts. You know what I'm saying? But I'm not locked in culturally. I'm not locked in culturally. You know, I can move about culturally where I can't racially. What happens though, some people feel bad about having to say, well, I'm of this race, but I subscribe to this culture, because what society puts on us, because society says you look this way, so that means that you should act this way. Okay? So in your group, once again, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes. I'll give you 3 because this is a tougher topic. Define your ethnic identity. And you cannot say American. All right? You can say WASP, but you cannot say American. Go. Now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're basically 50 minutes into the actual bill. What we're going to do is, this is part 1. We will continue either part 2, and it'll roll us on through to the end, or we'll come back with a little bit more. But I don't want to extend it out too far because I want to make it bite-sized. Again, this is a conversational piece, could set up for a larger discussion regarding certain things. But an introduction of WASP to you has been inserted in the conversation when you have people who talk about blah, blah, blah Americans. To be American is to be WASP. This is now interjected into the conversation. Let them get around that. Have a good time with that. On the other side, of the flip side of that, please like the show, share the show, tell a friend, tell a friend. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Also, if you're not subscribed to Science with Sean, I've been heavy with Science with Sean shows. Go subscribe to Science with Sean. I'm really trying to build up the channel. It shouldn't be stuck at where it is. I'm gonna put the link in the chat right now for people who can get familiar with that. Like I said, this is an educational piece. And what you're going to see from me moving forward, specifically with information, the way that I actually address it is to advance the conversation scholastically the way that it actually should be, and not demonize or speak from ignorance. You're going to see me refer to sources. You're going to see me bring or interject certain aspects of things into the conversation that will help you move the needle. We understand that scientifically that us Homo sapiens sapiens are 99.9 point something percent similar. However, there's a difference that could change the color of our skin. There's a gene that could change the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, the color of our hair, and we come from all walks of life, so that's not it. But here in America, it's more, the conversation is more socially driven, and we just got to really slow things down and then uncover the conversation the way that it needs to be, give it a historical context, and put things into play the way that it need to, so that things can advance and we don't just do circles. We don't argue in circles, or we don't argue from ignorance. So I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Again, like the show, share the show. The link for Science with Sean is in the description. Of course, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between 3 different channels. Continue to provide content. And I appreciate everybody for tuning in, man. And make sure you go pick up your copy of